Let's open our Bibles to Matthew 24. As we turn to Matthew 24, we're turning to the promises and predictions of Christ when He was giving a private briefing to His disciples. He was explaining the future to them. He was telling them everything that would happen from His first advent, that's Jesus Christ living and walking here on earth as God in human flesh, God incarnate, until His second advent. So Jesus gives the most concise and the most specific summary of especially what would lead up to His second advent, His second advenio, His coming to the earth. Actually, he describes it as Him coming and touching down on the earth. And that's why the predictions, the signs, the promises of Christ's second coming are not connected to His coming for His church, because they're quite dissimilar. And at another time, we'll look at all the differences between what that word that's not in the Bible, rapture, that's not in the Bible, so you don't ever have to argue for the rapture, because it's a word that's not even in the Bible. But Christ, harpazo, is in the Bible, right? Harpazo, do you all know that word? That's the Greek word. And it means the snatching and the taking out of His church. It's like pulling out of the fire, something you don't want to get burned. And He says, I'm going to pull out my church before my wrath is poured on this planet. The second coming is when His wrath is poured on this planet. And that's what we're looking at successively. And what Jesus does is, and we're going to look at the first 14 verses of Matthew 24 in just a moment and read them. But Jesus summarizes in a sermon that's called by theologians the Olivet Discourse, He summarizes the elements of what the earth would look like when He comes back in glory, when He comes back in the clouds, when He comes back and every eye shall see Him, and when He comes back and when His feet touch the Mount of Olives from which He ascended, when He comes back to that very spot and there's a cataclysmic global convulsion, earthquake, and splitting and rending of the mountains, and it's kind of half day, half night. It's just a time when the whole planet is going to be mourning because there's nowhere to hide from His face. That event is described in detail in Matthew 24. We have already seen 6 elements, and we've studied those that are given in God's Word. I call them all global. Now, I want you to think about the fact that all of these are trends. They are full-blown in the tribulation. The tribulation is what God calls the time when He gets the Jews ready to receive Him as their Messiah. You see, this whole thing is for them. It's to judge the sin in the world, but it's for them. It's to bring the Jewish people into such constricture and such a narrow place and such a nowhere else to turn that finally, as 2/3 of them are in the final Holocaust being decimated, in that instant, as their enemies are winning, they look up in that one instant, and at that second, Jesus Christ appears. And the whole 7 years is a build-up for that climactic moment where they have nowhere to turn. And they look up, and Zechariah 12-14 tells us that in that moment they realize that that's the one whom they pierced. God, who was pierced and who they crucified, and they turn in faith to Him. But all of those trends are global, and we've already seen global travel. Daniel talks about the global explosion of knowledge. Daniel talks about that. The global awareness of disasters. Jesus talked about that in Luke 21. He says that everyone is going to growingly get more petrified with the weather and with all the things they're becoming. It says the whole world will live in fear of what's going to be coming next. Well, that has never been. I mean, people heard about stuff, and they heard about it, like the Galveston hurricane where thousands were killed. They didn't even know it was coming, and let alone everyone being afraid of it. It's just, in our time period, it's happening. I mean, it's now that any person on their telephone could get stock quotes that used to have a seat on the exchange to have, 10 years ago. But now the information is just everywhere. And it's just shaping up for this global awareness of disasters. Then global communication, people talking to each other around the planet. In fact, that in Revelation 11, people across the world are discussing an event in Jerusalem. And remember, it took days and weeks to travel in the time the Bible was written. But there's global communications, there's global commerce. We talked about the digitalization of money, which we don't even think anything of. If I don't know how much has been lost so far around the world, but if that many trillions of dollars have been lost, I mean, it would have meant just about every possible object in the world would have been lost. But you notice that everything is still here. We've lost, I don't know how many tens or scores of trillions of dollars around the world's evaporated. Everything's still here because it was all digits. It wasn't gold. No one stole all the gold or the silver or even the money, the paper stuff. It's just zeros have disappeared. And that's amazing because the Bible predicted money would be digitalized. So we've seen that the 6 elements Jesus said would be present would be global travel, global knowledge that explodes, global disasters that everyone's aware of, global communication, people talking back and forth, global commerce, this digitalized money, and then this, as we saw most recently, the global apostasy, that there would be a global move toward the erasure of the once and for all delivered to the saints' faith. And we see that increasingly in the ecumenical dialogues that are going on, that what we're trying to do is bring doctrine down to a point where it offends no one except God. Okay? And it's just like we don't want anybody to be bothered, and we just keep lowering it. I'm talking about Christendom in general. And that global apostasy linked with demonism, which is just epidemic in all of the entertainment and the games and the movies and everything. There's just this demonic thing, with the counterpart of it being this whole astrology and necromancy that's telling the future from the dead and talking to the dead and lots of other things. It's just mushrooming around the world at this occultic awareness and this pagan, people going back to their pagan roots. But those are actually trends that will become full-blown. They'll become global realities during what is known in God's Word, the Bible, as the end of days. But after examining the first 6 of these 10 biggest trends that are clearly described in the Scriptures, we've come to the 7th. And that's in verse 7. We're going to read down to it in just a second. But in the 7th verse of Matthew 24, we see what may be described as either global pestilences or global, to use a more modern term, bio-terrorism, or something more understandable, global plagues. And if you look, Christ's words are ominous. He says in verse 7, right in the middle, it says that there will be famines. And look at the next word, pestilences, and then earthquakes. And then he says, in various places. What he means is all over. They're just going to be kind of like just popping up all over, these pestilences. And the question we need to ask ourselves, are we starting to see bio-terrorism, germ warfare, plague spreading? Are we seeing that starting to rear its ugly head in modern times? Well, amazingly, last month in January of 2009, people all over the world were reeling from bank collapses. Did you see today, I forget, HSBC or one of those big banks is thinking of asking their stockholders to cough up $20 billion to help them capitalize the bank. Didn't ask for deposits. They're asking for a cash call. I mean, the whole world is just trying to figure this whole thing out. Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister of England, is thinking of doing an Obama thing and to do $500 billion rescue of their banks. And it's like, how can you spend money you don't have? But that's what we've all been doing. So I guess you just do more and bigger. But while we're all watching that, people are seeing their savings evaporate and jobs being lost. I mean, no one even shuddered when General Motors said and Ford said they're going to lay off 50,000 more. Because, didn't know anybody else was still working there. It's just happened so fast. And it's just happening like that. And the economic earthquakes with I don't know if you saw that natural gas, because all these furnaces, the blast furnaces aren't going. They don't need so much natural gas, so they're starting to cap those things off. Well, once you start capping them off down 15,000 feet deep in the bottom of the Gulf, do you know how long it takes to uncap them? And so even George Soros said, this is the most enduring, continuing economic disaster that surpasses, Soros said, and he's the big money currency speculator that's made billions playing with currencies. he said, this is far worse than the Great Depression. Well, whatever they're saying, we're all watching that. This general financial uncertainty all across the borders of the world. And we're continuing to watch that. But while it's going on, something went right through the news services in January. Nobody even paid any attention to it. I mean, if we hadn't had the election and the meltdown, people would have been horrified if they were just watching normal news. Because something happened that took us at warp speed toward the horrific reality of global pestilences. While almost all the world's attention and news services have been glued to the continuing financial meltdown, the swindles, most recently this guy in Houston that's taken, I don't know how much, from hundreds of thousands of people. Common working people are losing billions and financial markets are losing trillions. One item passed us by. And it happened in Africa. Now, some of you probably read it. In a lonely terror training camp, a small group of terrorists that were stationed in northern Africa may have proved last night that the most feared scourge of modern civilization may be in the process of being weaponized. And I'm not talking about atomic stuff. I'm talking about simple stuff. It's possible that the billions of pathogens aimed at human destruction, in the past called the Black Death, are now awaiting the bidding of their new handlers. Germ warfare is very lethal. In fact, in a matter of just a few hours, 40 Al-Qaeda fighters were dead. Now, the only thing that we're unclear about, and the British News Service is examining this, is either those 40 in North Africa were experimenting with, or they were being experimented on by the plague, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. We don't know they don't put out press releases saying, we're close to getting all of you. But they're just constantly working on these methods of terror. But the Black Death, which comes in various forms, was one of the deadliest pandemics. Now, epidemic is when what you have, let's see, how did they describe that? It's just people are sick when it's over there, but it's everyone's sick when your family's sick. But an epidemic is when you and your neighbors are sick. It's just there's some way of saying, well, epidemics are common. Pandemics are when they sweep borders. And pandemics are few, where everyone has the same disaster. The deadliest pandemics where everyone was having an epidemic in human history was in 1340, when 75 million people died of this Black Death. By the way, if you read the British newspapers, I'm not going to describe how they die. They call it the Black Death, and it's passed by fleas on rats. And you can just imagine Black Death must have something to do with what it does to them. So it's awful. But the bubonic plague is spread from bites from infected rat fleas. The symptoms include, before you get to the horrible stuff, painful boils, and there's even an airborne kind called the pneumonic plague, and that spreads like flu, and without any medication, it just ripples through populations. And usually you can't get the medicine fast enough as it just starts spreading, especially the aerosol one. Well, these terrorists, they were not practiced enough to be accurate. They did manage to release legions of these deadly pathogens, and though poorly aimed, soon the pestilence weapon will be at their command of these new evil masters. We know they will finally perfect biowarfare because John the Apostle watched it. If you read Revelation 6 sometime, read it just before you go to bed. It really makes you sleep peaceful. It talks about the fact that death, and it talks about death as this pale green color, kind of like gangrenous. And it says death begins stalking the planet. And it says that 1/4 of all the people on the earth die from the beasts. I remember when I was little and I used to read that. Billy Graham would give out the living prophecies, and I'd get it through the mail. And I was 10 years old. I was reading it, and I thought, wow, bears, lions, snakes. No, there aren't enough bears, lions, snakes, and killer whales and octopuses and jellyfish to kill 1/4 of everybody on the planet. The word actually is the word that is used in Greek when describing what we would call microbes, small beasts, pathogens biological agents that are deadly. Well, that's the background to the words that Christ spoke in Matthew 24. As we read through, especially verse 7, think germ warfare. Think of the chilling description John gave us. Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 what John saw on Patmos and what he wrote down for us by the Spirit of God. And what he tells us is the beginning of the end of days for planet Earth.